Welcome to Politics Chat, in which I try to answer your questions about modern politics. So, I want to start with a place that feels like we've said it a lot before, but it really astonishes me that it's not front and center all the time. And that is the mental acuity of President Donald Trump. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, I urge you to go to that website I've told you about before called trumpstruth.org. And what that does is it reproduces, along with the date and the time, all of the uh, uh, social media messages that comes from Trump's Truth Social account. Now, again, we know that those aren't necessarily coming from him. There are other people who do post from there, but they are a window into the White House and into Donald Trump's mind because he has to approve the stuff that goes up there. And today is Tuesday, July 28th. Beginning last weekend, once again, he was on a posting spree that was badly uh, in line with mental health, with where the president's mental health should be. Lots of AI slop, lots of "I'm the best of everything," lots of attacks on other people, and so on. There are many ways in which the reason I started with that is that I looked at it and I thought, in a way, if you're thinking about this era in history, I don't know how you can go anywhere other than starting with the fact that the president's not okay. And we seem to be acting as if he is. And that itself is interesting and is important because I do think that we have gone through a series of decades in which the politicians on the right and some of the media has normalized the concept that Republicans should run the country and that Democrats should not. And therefore, by definition, a Republican can behave in really outrageous ways. And Trump's not the only one out there acting in outrageous ways right now. And they can get away with it, while a Democrat always has to be squeaky clean and always has to triple prove themselves. And I think, one of the things you keep seeing when you hear people say, well, can you imagine if Obama had, or can you imagine if Biden had? And the bottom line is they wouldn't have done those things. But anybody who saw any other president, any Democratic president anyway, acting in the way Trump is acting would be all over it. And that's in the media. And that's also, I think, in the Democratic Party as well as in the Republican Party. And I just feel like we got to have front and center that the Republicans have put in charge of the United States of America, in the most powerful position in the freaking world, a man who is not able to fulfill the duties and the responsibilities of that office. And there is some great level of simply pretending that he's okay, and he's not. So I wanted to start there, and obviously feel free to disagree with me, but my evidence is coming from watching him, not as a doctor, but just as a human being, and from reading that Truth Social account, from reading that Trump's Truth account, trumpstruth.org account, that makes a record of the things that he has posted or that have been posted in his name on Truth Social. So I wanted to start there because, again, I think that presumption that it's okay if a Republican does things that are bonkers, where it's not okay when a Democrat says anything out of line or, floats an idea that might not be popular. I think that really matters. And I think that matters a lot for our voting patterns, and it matters a lot for the way we think about the country. So I wanted to start by calling that out and then do just a little bit of some of the things that are in the news to show what that means. And just so you know, I don't know about you, but I am finding it extremely difficult to follow the news here in the summer of 2026 because there's so much coming at us all the time. And one of the things that it's very, very hard to wrap your mind around, and I'll get to that in just a minute, is the degree to which our world is changing by the people in power changing regulations that we might not really be focusing on. Because for the most part, at least I anyway, and I assume a lot of you, sort of have general ideas about what the laws of historic preservation are. Generally we like to preserve historic things, right? But it's hard to get something called a historic monument, for example. We sort of have these general ideas, but what the administration has been doing really all along, but really taking off lately, is changing pieces of those laws that most of us don't even know existed. We didn't really think about how those things worked. And you're seeing that now in a real attempt, for example, to rework the way we understand historic monuments. I've written about that recently, so I'm not going to talk about it today. I'm going to give you new material today. But that idea of changing pieces of things is really changing our world a lot, and they're very hard to follow. So that's coming along at the same time. We also have the war in Iran. We have the problems in the economy. We have the various outrages that the administration is committing against immigrants or descendants of immigrants. We've got, just this attacks on our national forests. You just have stuff coming and coming and coming. And so it's really hard to make sense of a lot of it. So what I'm trying to do today is give you sort of a bigger picture for the ways to think about some of the specific things that are happening. All right, so with somebody in the White House whose primary interest seems to be to enrich himself and his cronies, including his family, and there's tons of articles about that now coming out every day, the degree to which the Trump family has enriched itself. What we are not seeing in the actions of the administration is anything that's particularly successful for the American people. And let me give you some specifics here. So one of the things that you think about this era, what is the one thing Trump has been really successful at in his second term? He did one thing. He cut taxes for the very wealthy and corporations. And he has opened up a lot of avenues for very wealthy people to make money. And he's cut regulations. But what he's really done is he's cut those taxes. Okay, put a pin in that, because he has been very successful at helping very wealthy people, but not so much everybody else. So, one of the stories that I have been watching all along is, if you recall, on September 2nd of 2025, the administration began to attack small boats in the Caribbean, apparently coming from Venezuela, although they've come from other countries as well, and also small boats in the Eastern Pacific, right in that area, that sort of circle that you can push down on that area of the globe. And the argument on the part of the administration has been that the people in those boats are drug traffickers and that they are hitting what they call narco terrorists, but they've never produced any evidence at all. And the people who are the people who've been killed in those, their family members have stepped up to say, no, he's a fisherman. And none of this has played out in courts yet. But one of the arguments that the administration made was that these attacks on these boats would stop the flow of drugs into the country. And the news broke, I think it was today or yesterday, that in fact the agents who are responsible for tracking the flow of drugs into the United States says that this has had no effect at all. Basically, people who are bringing drugs into the country are simply using alternative routes, which kind of makes sense, right? And at the same time, you have the increasing understanding of the legal community that the attacks on these boats are extra legal, they're extrajudicial. That is, they could be and probably are murders, and possibly some of them are war crimes. And that's just hanging out there. And the degree to which we're really not paying attention to it seems somewhat problematic. But where I'm going with this is that the US military has been striking these small boats. They've been killing the people on these small boats. They've been destroying the boats and killing these people. And it's been expensive, and it is at almost I'm not a lawyer. It is certainly has the hallmarks of murder and possibly war crimes. And we now know, almost a year into this, that I believe there's more than 200 people who have been killed, that it doesn't appear to have done anything at all. And you look at that and you think, this was not a good policy. No matter how you slice it, this was not a good policy. If indeed its intention was to stop drugs coming into the United States. I think you always have to keep open the possibility anytime you see something like this, that there was actually another intention, that whatever that their goals were something different than what they told people, because it just logically doesn't make sense that you would continue to do something that was failing unless you had a different goal. But in terms of the American people, the idea that they have protected us from the onslaught of cocaine in this case, although they implied it was um, uh, meth, I think. Yes. No, fentanyl. They implied it was fentanyl, but it was always cocaine. The fentanyl doesn't come from Venezuela. I'm not going to go into where the drugs come from, but it's cocaine that they were hitting, although they alluded to the fentanyl crisis in the United States to try and make people think that's what they were talking about. In this particular case, it has not done what they said they were going to do. So that was a story in the news that I've been watching. But then there is also the story of Iran. And the story of Iran is really interesting because that's a place where the Trump administration, led by Donald Trump, of course, decided to take matters into their own hands and launch a war of choice. That is, under our Constitution, the Congress is supposed to have the final say on whether or not the United States engages in war. And under the 1973 War Powers Act, the president can respond to an imminent threat that does not have time to go before Congress, so long as he notifies Congress in writing within 2 days. And then he's got 60 days to get either to get the troops out of there or to get congressional permission to continue. And of course, what Trump has done there is he said that there was an imminent threat from Iran, even though his advisors said there was not. And then he when the 60 days was up for the war powers invocation that he had made on March 2nd, and that day was up on May 1st, he simply said, oh, well, this was over on April 7th when I said there was a ceasefire, even though we were still engaging in a blockade, which is an act of war, and there was still firing going on, and therefore I don't need congressional approval. And then he turned around within the last couple of weeks and gave Congress another notification of the War Powers Act saying, this is a different engagement, which is, just honestly ridiculous. I'm sorry. That's a case where, I'm going to weigh in as a historian. You don't get to continue the same war and just put a new name on it and say, this gets me around the War Powers Act. But the whole idea behind this was he expected that there would be a quick, easy payoff, that America would be able to reorganize the Iranian leadership and probably gain access to Iranian oil the same way the United States appears to have done with Venezuela. The opaqueness of all these deals is just killing me as a historian, by the way, but it appears we're taking a significant amount of oil and money out of Venezuela. Nobody knows where it's going. Trump said today that it was going into running the country. But so far, it appears that the United States has reinvested about $300 million into Venezuela after the terrible, terrible natural disaster there of a few weeks ago. But there's no record of where any of that other many billions of dollars has gone. So apparently he wanted to do something similar in Iran. And that's, of course, not how it played out. So there's been news today in Iran that is, I've said to you a lot of times and talked about this. I mean, the issue of Iran is really interesting because Trump has always had someone to fix him. He's always had somebody who can pick up the pieces and he can turn things okay after he's screwed up. His father, Alan Weisselberg, who was the chief financial officer of the Trump organization, the adults in the room in his first term who literally took papers off his desk so he didn't do stupid things. He doesn't have that now, and he has gotten himself in a colossal mess in Iran. By the way, he's gotten the United States in there too. There's that old expression about having your tail in a crack, and boy, does he have his tail in a crack in Iran. Unfortunately, so does the United States. But there's news that has broken within the last day that the United States is actually running low on the kinds of ammunition we need in a number of different places because not only of Trump's strikes on Iran, his extraordinary strikes on Iran, but also on, I think it's 8 other countries that he has struck since he has been in office. And that idea that he has run us low on ammunition for his wars, for his strikes, is I think speaks back to whether or not this is good for the United States of America. Did it help us to strike Yemen when the Houthis, in fact, did not back off on their attacks and are now once again threatening shipping that is going through the Bab el Mandeb Strait? Um, or whether it was worth it for us to attack some of the other countries that he has chosen to attack. I think there's about 8 of them, and off the top of my mind, I can't give them all to you, and I'm worried I'm going to say the wrong ones, so I'm not giving you any of the ones I think I can remember. But if you're looking for a president who's helping the American people, the idea that we're low on ammunition is problematic. And the administration says, no, that's not true. Anybody who is saying that is a traitor. That's not, or is giving you bad information. That's not true. But it was a pretty well sourced story. But then there's another piece of this, and that is as of today, which is July 28th, there has been a new report on the actual numbers of deaths and casualties. And once again, just to be clear, this is something a lot of people get confused. There are war deaths and there are casualties, and casualties include people who are wounded during a war. And you hear this all the time when you're studying the Civil War. People get confused between casualties and dead. So in Iran now, the administration revised its numbers today because remember earlier this week they took away 4 deaths associated with the war in Iran. One was in Iraq and 3 were in Jordan, associated with the war in Iran, and said, no, those aren't actually war deaths because they happened after the ceasefire. And then they backed off on that, but they got a lot of pushback on that. So as of today, they've put those 4 dead back into the number of troops that have died. It is back up to 18 troops that have died in that war. But then they also said that another 624 have been wounded. Now, until then, the numbers that they said were wounded were 482. Significant increase in numbers of wounded, and those wounded, we know from an earlier report, they have said that they were not seriously wounded, but then they later explained that to be not. In order to be considered seriously wounded or very seriously injured by the army, you had to be within danger of dying in the next 72 hours. So to say somebody's not seriously wounded essentially means that they're not expecting them to die in the next 72 hours, which is a different standard than people think of when they hear seriously wounded, right? Those civilians of us who are in that. So they've had to increase that number. And again, it's very unclear how we are going to get out of that Iran war. What is not unclear, though, is how badly it has hurt the United States of America's standing in the world to be tied into this war, that it's really not clear to see how we're going to get out of that war. But then there's a couple other places that the administration is weirdly not serving the American people. And by weirdly, I don't mean, I do think you can argue that most other presidents, not all of them, but most other presidents might have done stuff you didn't like. And there certainly are ones who did stuff I didn't like, but they could at least make an argument that what they were doing was good for the American people. And Trump just seems to have abandoned that. So the other big story of the last week is the reimposition, I think it was on Friday, of more tariffs. Now, if you remember, the Supreme Court struck down Trump's tariffs of April 2nd, 2025, those Liberation Day tariffs, because they said they were unconstitutional. And that matters a lot because the reason they said they were unconstitutional is because quite literally, the United States Constitution establishes that Congress and Congress alone can engage in revenue measures. So let me see if I actually have it here for you. Yeah. The Congress, Article 1, Section 8 reads, the Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. That's the Congress. The president does not have that power. So when the Supreme Court said to him, dude, you can't do this, I paraphrase, by the way, he instantly flipped to a different tariff law that he could use for 150 days in times of an international financial crisis. And then when that ran out on Friday, he flipped to a different way to impose tariffs that said that he could impose tariffs against people who were using forced labor, uh, cheap labor to produce goods. And he said that 90, I think it's 99 point, I think it's 4%, but let's say almost all of the goods that were coming to the United States, according to him, were products of this forced labor system, and that he was doing the tariffs because of that. And I just love the comment from the White House that he'd always cared deeply about here we go. He said, forced labor is something that President Trump has been focused on for many years. I'm sorry, I missed that, I have to say. But what you're seeing here is him very deliberately taking over the power of Congress to levy tariffs. Tariffs are taxes, by the way. And that's really interesting, because the question is that we kind of have danced around is, why does he want these tariffs so badly? And they talk a lot. The White House talks a lot about how that's going to rebuild American manufacturing, and that's not wrong. There are certain ways in which you can think of Joe Biden actually retaining some of the tariffs Trump had put on in his first term in order to protect the American electric battery uh, markets, so you could develop those factories without outside competition, and that it's actually a thing. But what has happened under Trump is you've got these all over the map tariffs, so that in fact manufacturing development is not happening at all, because you don't know what to invest in. It's such a mess that manufacturing is actually down under Trump fairly significantly. So why is he doing this? And one of the things that he said repeatedly on the campaign trail was that tariffs could replace income taxes. And this was actually, I'm going to go a little bit into the weeds here. This is actually a thing when the Democrats under Woodrow Wilson in 1913 passed the 1913 Revenue Act. The Republicans went ballistic. And the reason they went ballistic is because in that 1913 Revenue Act, the Democrats lowered the tariffs coming out of the late 19th century, and they replaced the income with the income tax. They replaced the missing revenue. I'm sorry, I shouldn't use the word income there. They replaced the missing revenue with the income tax. And to this day, there are people who insist that the Revenue Act of 1913 was the downfall of American society, because it starts the modern day income tax. Of course, we have the income tax during the Civil War. That's when it's invented by the Republican Party, and it's a progressive income tax. It has three different brackets by the end of the war. But a business Supreme Court later declares that unconstitutional. I'm not going to go into the whole history of the income tax, although it's really interesting, and someday I'll write about it for you. But I think what you see here is Trump basically trying to take money from the American people, which is what the tariffs do, in order to provide relief for people who are paying income taxes. And there we are, back to that idea of lower income taxes for the very wealthy. You simply put tariffs on things so that individual consumers are paying that money, and all of a sudden you don't have to worry so much about giving tax breaks to the very wealthy. But we're not developing here a picture of a president who's actually working for the American people. And I kind of wanted to call that out today, because he's also, I'm sorry, cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, right? So what's going on here? Why is he being so supported by enabling Republicans? And I think that idea that he is moving money upward, that he is cutting taxes for the very wealthy, he's cutting regulations, he's open drilling land, and he is trying to fund the government first by cutting programs that ordinary Americans use, but also by switching the weight of our revenue system back to the ordinary Americans on where it was in the late 19th century that changed it in 1913. I think you're seeing a group of people saying, I don't care if he falls asleep everywhere or is posting crazy on social media or any of that stuff. I'm happy to keep him because he's really helping us rich people. I think that's one of the things, but I also think you can see the degree to which the Republicans doubled down on the idea that Democrats are anti-American, are bad for society. And you can really see how they embrace the evangelical right, the radical right, that after the about 1965, when you got the legalization of the use of contraception by married couples, it becomes illegal for unmarried couples after 1972. You can see this emphasis on sort of returning the world as they imagine it to a previous, again, imagined world that meant that women wouldn't take on roles outside the home. And focusing on that and really making abortion the symbol of that, reproductive rights the symbol of that, so thoroughly tied that evangelical vote to the Republican Party that now they're sort of in lockstep. The idea that only Republicans should have the right to rule, that no matter how good a Democrat is, no matter what they do for the country. And again, I just have to emphasize that the Biden administration was one of the most productive administrations in our history. No matter what they do, they are illegitimate. And I could walk you through that at more length, but I'm actually going to run out the door so Joanna and I can make it to this gig that we got to go to. But I want to leave you in one other place, and that's that it certainly feels like that is starting to crack. And what I mean by that is that you can see the degree to which the administration is trying to weaponize the Department of Justice, right? He's really using the Department of Justice to go after those people he perceives to be his enemies, pretty clearly hoping that there will be really splashy trials this summer that will make it look like indeed the Democrats are really bad guys. But increasingly, you can see judges saying, we don't trust you anymore. We can't trust what you say because you've weaponized the Department of Justice. And so one of the things that's happened in the last couple of days is that the the judge has really questioned the Department of Justice's indictment of David Hearn, who was the former Olympian who reached down into the reflecting pool and touched a piece of it. And they tried to say he had done damage to the reflecting pool, that he was a vandal. And the government's own witness now is saying that, in fact, Hearn didn't appear to do anything to cause any additional damage to it. And that's very much sort of on the table for poor Mr. Hearn, who, like, who wouldn't have touched that? Maybe you wouldn't have, but I don't know. I don't want to see what it felt like. And it's pretty clearly that he is being railroaded over this because they wanted people to believe that there was actually vandalism on that reflecting pool. But then the other place that you are seeing things is with the Epstein files. And this is going to be really something to watch because Katie Fang, who's an independent journalist, actually sued Todd Blanche, the acting attorney general, who is up for confirmation before the Senate right now, to get him to release a number of actual documents from the Epstein files, which by law he had to do by last December 19th. And the Department of Justice had to do, and they over redacted them and then refused to release a lot of them. She sued and said, I want to see why these are redacted. And a judge said the end of last week that he ordered Blanche to show him by himself, if Katie Fang can't see these, to show him those documents and to explain why they were redacted. And the judge could come out and say, yeah, you're right, they should have been redacted. But the judge could also come out and say, you should never have done that. And because the Epstein Files Transparency Act says by law you could only redact the names of victims, and anything else that was a part of an active lawsuit, although I'm not even sure is that. It might just have been the names of victims. And these things are largely redacted. That's probably not what they've done. And so you're starting to see the rubber meeting the road, in that either Todd Blanche is going to have to produce this as the law requires, or he's going to tell the judge he's not going to do it. And we are really in a mell of a hess if that happens, because he will be openly saying, I'm not going to follow the law. I'm not going to do what the judge says. And so it's worth watching that right now. But it's also worth paying attention to the fact that I think the larger picture of what we're seeing is not just Trump melting down. It's this entire project of only the Republicans get to rule because they're going to cut taxes and cut regulations, which is what the very wealthy want, and because they're going to try and rebuild this fantasy of a traditional America, which is what the really loyal Trump voters want. You're seeing that, and you're seeing a lot of Americans sitting here going, where are my tax dollars going? Which I have to say is a big issue for me as I'm watching all this stuff. Did you see the thing today about how many Escalades he has just ordered, which were really expensive? I looked it up. If you took the average cost of a fairly cheap Escalade, the cost was over $62 million. Don't write that down. I just did it. I just literally pulled up my phone and started typing in numbers. But you're seeing ordinary Americans going, what's the point of a government that is literally taking our money and using it for things like bombing these guys in the Caribbean for who knows why, for this war in Iran that appears only to have injured us by raising prices by both of oil and of groceries and of everything that comes into the any products that we buy. At the same time, it's killing thousands of Iranians. And at the same time, we're losing Americans, we're losing more money, and now we've got another set of tariffs. And it just sort of feels like we're in this period where Trump and his inability to function, basically, seems almost to be a larger symbol of the Republican Party in this moment, where it's all falling apart. And that's not to say it's not incredibly dangerous. Trump is still trying desperately to hammer through the idea of rigging the vote by trying to get some aspect of the Save Act or whatever, and that certainly could still happen. But the bigger picture here, where we've got so much stuff coming at us, just seems like, what are we doing here, folks? And it seems like more people who are looking at the diarrhea lettuce and the rise of measles and the many ways in which our society is falling apart around us since Trump's got in office a second time, are starting really to re-examine what government is supposed to do, and they're not finding it in Donald Trump. And if that means that we start to abandon that decades old idea that somehow Democrats are illegitimate and Republicans are the only legitimate rulers, that's actually exactly what happened in the late 19th century, and that led to the rise of the progressive era and the whole first half of the 20th century being dominated, really, with a few very brief exceptions, by the Democratic Party. If you'd like to tune in live, I record these chats on Tuesday and Thursday at 6 p.m. Maine time on both my YouTube channel and my Facebook page. If you want to hear more from me, I write Letters from an American every night. It's available on Substack and on Facebook, and the audio version of the nightly letter is available the following day wherever you get your podcasts. And finally, on Saturday mornings, I talk with Dr. Joanne Freeman, the historian of the early republic, professor, and dear friend, about history and politics. We call our talks What the Heck Just Happened, and you can find them on YouTube. Politics Chat is produced by Lauren Westfall, music by Andrea Von Kampen.